want to talk about the one that the officer saved the girl from suicide on the train track. Last week I was here with Ross Kramer and we talked about one that was a person jumping off a bridge who was also saved by law enforcement. So an incredible thing, heroes of the day. Also in this case, it's important to note that they took her for a psychiatric evaluation. So they did step 2 hero action and they got her some assistance. Any thoughts on that story, Ross?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we see a lot of cases here where body cams are put on police officers and law enforcement to protect the public and to have a full record of what happens. And a lot of times it helps the prosecution in cases like we saw in the case in Chicago. Here, it seems like it's showing the other side of that and showing the great work that some police officers do in protecting the public. So, you know, obviously it can cut both ways.
Great stories, Anthony Velez. Thank you for those. Now we're going to get an amazing summary of the case of Florida versus Denise Williams by our very own Rachel Stockman. So we're going to have that in a few minutes, but just a reminder, this is the case in which Denise Williams was married to Mike Williams. Mike Williams was murdered. Now, after he was murdered, fast forward, this was years ago in 2000. In 18 years ago. In 2016, Brian Winchester, who was friends with the defendant and the victim, was arrested on other charges, kidnapping or attempting to kidnap, and some other charges. And in conjunction with those arrests, he then got immunity, made a deal with the prosecutors to tell them exactly what happened in this case. He actually led them to the body. Let's listen as Rachel gives us a good synopsis of this case.
A Florida woman is facing life in prison for allegedly helping to plot her husband's murder. Denise Williams is on trial for murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact for her involvement in the 2000 disappearance and death of her husband, Jerry Michael Williams. Mike was reported missing in December of 2000 after not returning home from a duck hunting trip on Lake Seminole. A few years after the couple married in 1994, Williams is accused of encouraging her husband to take out 3 life insurance policies, totaling over $1.7 million. 2 of these 3 policies were signed off on by the victim's best friend, Brian Winchester. Winchester and Williams allegedly began having an affair in 1997. And according to interviews by Winchester, the 2 began planning Mike's death at least 10 months before he went missing. The indictment claims that Williams collaborated on planning the death of Michael Williams, who ultimately died at the hands of Winchester. Williams began filing to collect the benefits of the life insurance policies just 11 days after Mike went missing. A separate indictment on insurance fraud charges claims Williams reported her husband's death as accidental drowning. Williams and Winchester married in 2005 but split a number of years later. Winchester is currently serving 20 years in prison for a kidnapping charge in 2016 when he held Denise at gunpoint in her car for a number of hours. After he pled no contest to the charges, he agreed to provide information on Michael's death, implicating Denise in this twisted plot and taking investigators to Mike's body in 2017. Williams is pleading not guilty to the charges, claiming she had nothing to do with the murder. For Law and Crime, I'm Rachel Stockman.
Thank you, Rachel. So that certainly outlines all the different players and relationships and affairs. And so, you know, I've shown you my chart that I had to do to keep all the people straight. Let me ask you, Ross, as a trial attorney, is it something that you would do to show the jury the relationship with the individuals? Would you actually make a chart of who everyone is to keep it straight? Do you think that's helpful or not to a jury?
Well, absolutely. The way you see these a lot from prosecutors is in organized crime cases, you know, where they have to show how things work, that there's a head of a family, that there are people working below him, that there are people working below them, and to show an organizational chart that actually ties everyone together. In a convoluted case like this, I don't see why the prosecutors wouldn't use that, because so many people have long relationships together, romantic relationships, friend relationships, family relationships in this town. I think it would be important. I don't know if the prosecutions used it here, but usually they put up a big whiteboard and they'll stick pictures and names to it with lines between them to show the relationships.
I think it'd be helpful in this case. You know, we've been talking about this case, done all of our research, viewing, watching, and I still every once in a while hear a name and say, wait, who is that? We are now going to turn to pre-recorded testimony of Brian Winchester. This is the one who admits that he did murder the victim in this case, and this is his cross-examination by the defense. All right, so this is the cross-examination, and again, Brian Winchester is the one that admits that he did kill the victim in this case. But this testimony cross-examination was about his subsequent crime in 2016 when he attempted to kidnap, get this, the defendant in the case, and the defendant in the case became his wife after the first husband was killed. Ross, what's the significance or relevance of this testimony? What's defense doing?
The significance of this is that it is going to be so hard for this jury to figure out what is going on, who is telling the truth, who has a relationship with who has a reason to lie here. I mean, what they were doing is setting up his motive to testify falsely, that's the defendant's theory here, testify falsely and implicate the defendant. And that's because he was arrested on a charge that carried a potential of life in prison, and he went to cooperate. And he went in to help the police build a case against someone else and got 20 years instead. Of course, the jury is going to look at this and say, yeah, he had a motive to cooperate to get a lower sentence, but at the same time, it's very hard to get up on the witness stand under oath and admit to committing murder and conspiracy to murder if that's not actually how it happened. This is going to be a very, very difficult case for this jury to unravel. I would not expect a quick verdict one way or the other.
All right. Let's hear some more of his testimony on cross-examination. Well, you heard it straight from Brian Winchester. He had an 8-year affair with the victim's wife in this case. So, Ross, you talked earlier about credibility of witnesses being so important for the jury to have to determine. Do you find his testimony credible as you're listening?
I do, especially later on. It wasn't in that clip, but when he starts to break down, talking about what happened in the murder. I think it's very, very hard for a witness to get up on a witness stand under oath, lie, and concoct a story where he is the trigger man on a murder of a friend. I think that would be a very hard thing to do credibly, and I think here his testimony was credible. I think that when you link this up with the insurance policies, which I think the prosecution is relying on those probably as their two main pieces of evidence here, I think this is a stronger case than I had given it credit for before we start to see all the pieces fall into place. And where you're really going to see that is in closing statements, because that's the prosecutor's chance to put all these separate pieces together and show how they form a story when you look at them all holistically.
And, you know, insurance proceeds, just as a reminder to our viewers, or if you've just joined us, it was $1.75 million, 3 different insurance policies that were paid out to the defendant, Denise Williams, in this case. She's also facing fraud charges for those payouts, and that will be a separate, different criminal matter and or trial. Ross Kramer, always a delight to have you as our criminal defense attorney. Thank you for coming back on as an analyst, and we'll see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. Join us after a short break. We'll be right back to continue to analyze this trial on Law and Crime. Great.